chilly November day, which is, compared to what's coming is not, so I know, it's not so cold, right? It's just, we're not used to it.
Which could be chillier.
Which could be, oh, of course it could be chillier, I know. Okay, did you start? Yeah. Okay, all right, so welcome everybody. It's good to see you. And so today's book is, I should use the microphone, right? It's easier.
Yes, please.
Okay, Kantika. How many read it? Got to read it?
Didn't get it.
Started? Okay, no, couldn't get it.
I put my name.
I know, there are not so many copies. Okay, you'll read it when you, worth reading when your name comes up. Did you read it?
Yeah.
Oh, you started?
Yeah, I read it before it was on your list.
Right, because it was, yeah.
They're the quarter way.
Okay, all right. So it says Kantika, a novel, as I always say. You know, it's interesting that how books are prefaced with a novel, short fictions or fictions, like the Amor Tolls book, A Table for Two, was fictions, was a little subheading underneath, because if you remember that one had 6 short stories and then a novella that made up that book. So this is a novel. The dedication inside, the author is Elisabeth Graver. This is her 5th book, her 5th novel, and the dedication is for my mother, Suzanne Levy Graver, and in memory of my grandmother, Rebecca Cohen Baruch Levy. How's that for a name? Yes, that's quite the name. And the little epigraph at the beginning of the book is from a Ladino proverb, and it reads, I'm not so good at how I read Ladino, but I think you would say, Des a me entrar y me haceré lugar. So it's translated into English as, let me enter, des a me entrar, and I will make a place for myself. So that's the proverb, which is, you know, once you read the book and you think, oh, okay, so that can have several layers of meaning. Maybe the most obvious one after you finish the story, because this is a story of immigration. Immigration, but that, you know, just let me enter and I'll make a place for myself, which how many Jews back in the 20s and 30s and 40s were begging and pleading that same thing to America, just let us enter and that was not to be. So anyway, that's the beginning of the story. This is a fiction, but, and this is very interesting, it's based on, and the author is very open about it, it's based on her grandmother's story. The one that she dedicates to, the one that she says, in memory of my grandmother, Rebecca Cohen Baruch Levy. And her grandmother, so that's a bit of an interesting thing when you're reading the book, because it says fiction, but then she also says very clearly that she based it on her grandmother's story. And she doesn't fictionalize or change her grandmother's name. Her grandmother's name is there because when you read the book, her grandmother's name is Rebecca, and all the other names are the same. So it's, you're kind of thinking, well, she said it's a novel, but how much of it is novel and how much of it is real? So I found an interview with her because some people I was talking to afterwards said, you know, I don't understand it. It was kind of, I thought it was sort of strange because I couldn't figure out, like, is this fiction, is it nonfiction? Not that she hides it, she says it's based on my grandmother's story. I kept, and in the note, those of you who read the book, there's an author's note at the back, and she explains, and she says that although I wrote Kantika as a novel, I played with the line between fact and fiction and drew on the experiences of some real people, most centrally my maternal grandmother, Rebecca née Cohen Baruch Levy, who was born in 1902 till 1991. I used real names for several characters, including Rebecca, and made use of historical details, family stories, and photographs, because the sections are all, there's a photograph, a family photograph at the beginning of them, which I thought was lovely, and it added to it. And there's an explanation within the chapter of who the people in that photograph are. And they are real photographs, and so they're real photographs of the author's family, her own family. and yet, again, as I said, this is considered fiction, so it's kind of interesting. She said, so I use these real names, I made use of historical details, which is where I guess it could fall under historical, if you want to call it historical fiction, family stories and photographs, my family, even as I changed the facts to suit the story, as I imagined the inner lives of the characters and invented liberally at every turn. So it's a combination. And she says, so in an interview when she's asked about her book, and she says, so the interviewer says to her, so what is Kantika about? And she said, it's a story, this is the author explaining her book, of migration, motherhood, blended families, disability, because there's that aspect of it too, those of you who will read it. And it turns out that the author's aunt, Rebecca, her grandmother's is adopted or stepdaughter, has cerebral palsy, born in the 1930s with cerebral palsy. Back in that time, it was a major disability. It wasn't even, I don't know if they even referred to it as cerebral palsy back in the time. But this character is in Luna, it's the author's Aunt Luna, is an important part of the story. And so the disability aspect is another interesting aspect of the book. There are several aspects that are very interesting. The whole idea of emigration, the whole idea of the Turkish Jewish community, because this is not, we've read lots of family sagas or immigration stories in English, mainly from Ashkenazi point of views, at least traditionally that's where, somebody was referring to Belva Plain. Do you remember from many years ago? Yeah, 1978, I think. Belva Plain's book Evergreen, that was a big bestseller. Now I don't know if anybody, modern people have ever heard of it, but anyway, that was Ashkenazi, and there were several others of these sagas, but not so many told from a Sephardi point of view. Maybe in French or but probably not so many. And until kind of recently, there have been more. Particularly, I was thinking of you, Vivian, because I read something where they said that, this was an interesting article, where the author of this article says that for well over a century, the coming-of-age novel has been central to modern Ashkenazi literature in several languages. In Yiddish, so there was a book called Bread Givers. Has anybody heard of that? No. Yeah, okay. Yeah, Ansia Yezierska's Bread Givers, which told the story of the perilous climb of immigrant sisters through poverty and patriarchy on Hester Street. So you know how far back that goes. Then there were, anyways, she goes on, she lists other books. And those were all, and it continued through Bellow, Cynthia Ozek, and even Philip Roth. I mean, those you could say too are, Jewish immigrant, but Ashkenazi stories. Sephardi coming-of-age stories have been scanter in number, and they are a more recent phenomenon. So I guess you could put this book into that category. A disproportionate number of them are from North Africa and Egypt, because recently there have been ones in Egypt. For example, Andre Asiman's book Out of Egypt, which is his memoir. There was a book by Ronit Matalan called One Facing Us. Then there was Lucette Laniado's The Man in the White Sharkskin Suit, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Vivian. And so that was a Jewish, and subtitled The Jewish Family's Exodus from Old Cairo to the New World. And there have been others published in Hebrew. But by contrast, the Judeo-Spanish heritage especially of the Ottoman Empire, which is where the author's family, at least the author on her mother's side, because she said her father was Ashkenazi, European Jewish, but it's her mother's family. They were from Turkey, which was the Ottoman Empire. There are not so many stories about them. Although apparently there have been a couple of television series. Has anybody seen a series called Kulu on Netflix? Turkish? Anyways, apparently Turkish, and Kulu means the club on Netflix recently, and The Beauty Queen of Jerusalem. I don't know if anybody's been watching that. so that was also, and someone I'd never heard of, Apple TV has something called The Scent of Rain in the Balkans. Anybody heard of that one? That sounds interesting. Anyway, so Kantika is a work that now addresses that subject and that area. So she says here, the author, Elisabeth Graver, that she said, I wanted to pay homage to a vanishing culture. That's what I wanted to do with this book. And I was inspired by my maternal grandmother, who died in 1992, Rebecca Ney Cohen, Baruch Levy, because you remember, those of you who read the book, she married twice, so Levy was her maiden name, and Cohen was her maiden name, and then Baruch was the first husband's surname, and Levy was the second husband's surname. So she said, my grandmother died in 1992, but a few years prior to that, when I was 21 years old, I went down to Florida, where my grandparents, Rebecca and Sam is the second husband in the book, where they had retired, and I went to interview my grandmother, because I wanted to hear her stories. And she says, and Elisabeth Graver teaches English, she teaches writing at Boston College. She's an academic, that's what she does. And she says, I always tell my students, and she teaches creative writing and nonfiction writing, which I thought, oh, that's interesting. She teaches both. So this is kind of a combination of the two. I know she says a novel, but it's really, based so clearly on her family that she doesn't hide. So she says, I always tell my students, if you're lucky enough to have grandparents, record them. Get them to tell you their stories and their histories when they still can, if you're lucky enough to do so. So she said, when I was 21 years old, I went down to my grandmother, who was living in Florida at the time, and I asked her to please tell me stories about her life, and I recorded her. I had these 2 little cassettes with the stories, and that's what she's kept. And she said, and I treasure them because you have the voice of the person, as we all know. You have the voice of the person when you've recorded something. And she said, my grandmother was born in Istanbul in 1903 into a wealthy Sephardic Jewish family. But after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, her family, the Cohens, lost their fortune and conditions worsened for Turkish Jews. And the family had to move to Barcelona. And she writes about that in this book, how her father, who was this wealthy textile factory owner in Constantinople, lost his factory. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and along with it came economic chaos and collapse and a change of everything. And her father, who was also a gambler, that was another issue that he had, they were no longer wealthy, and he didn't know how to support his family. And in an ironic, twist of fate, or however you want to call it, they ended up moving to Barcelona, which was where the Jews had been expelled back in 1492 with Ferdinand and Isabella and their decrees of, the Jews either they were expelled, or they were burnt at the stake, or they had to convert. So that's why there became this community in the Ottoman Empire, because Turkey welcomed, that's interesting, because what Turkey is right now is not very welcoming, but Turkey welcomed Jews, and that's how her family was there. So, but anyway, then they had to leave. They moved to Barcelona, which was kind of a surprising destination, given that they had centuries prior, they had to leave. And when they went to Barcelona, she writes, there was hardly any thing of a community. Remember, she writes about that her father was kind of a secret synagogue that he became, and what kind of a job did he end up taking? First, he kind of told his family that, well, he's going to be the chazan, he's going to be the cantor in the synagogue, but that's not really what he was. He was the janitor of the synagogue, and this was, for a gentleman in his stature and he carried himself with a certain, confidence, arrogance, that growing up that he was wealthy in Turkey and a somebody in the community, and then to go to Barcelona and be reduced to scrubbing the stairs, which was hard for him, but harder probably for his wife and his children to watch what had happened to their father. So they go there, and then things in Barcelona were not so good after that. This was there were the 1930s, and there was the rise of fascism, and then there was going to be the Spanish Civil War, and then there was going to be the Second World War. So the tumultuous times that her family lived through become part of this book. And Rebecca, the author's grandmother was a very strong, enterprising, impressive young woman from a very early age, and the book is told largely through her voice. Although the author employs several voices, she tells the story from Rebecca mostly, but she also has her father tells a little bit of it, her mother Sultana tells a little bit of the story, even Luna, the stepdaughter with cerebral palsy, tells parts of the story too. Rebecca, though, is the center, and she remains the center of things in the book. Rebecca, and this is in the author's own words, can be difficult and exacting, but she is also lusty, creative, and determined to make a vibrant home in the world for herself and her family. That's how the author is summing the character up. And the author says, and that's why I think it's probably, it's timely in any case, it's interesting, but the author says, I was fascinated by how this migration story plays out differently for different people and across generations and countries. And she says to the person who's interviewing her that, for years I had this idea that I wanted to tell the story, and I resisted telling it for a long time because it felt too close to home and yet far away in terms of my lack of knowledge of many of its elements. And she, the author, says, I was raised in a culturally Jewish but very secular household. I always knew that my two sets of grandparents, my paternal ones were Ashkenazi, that these two sets of grandparents were very different from each other in the foods that they ate, in the languages that they spoke, in the way they practiced their religion. And she said, but I was particularly drawn to my maternal grandmother, Rebecca. She was full of song and stories, and she was endlessly creative, always making things. And that's what, from an early time on, we see this Rebecca as a young girl. She's making things, she's sewing, she learns to sew, because remember, this is back in the early 20th century, where teaching girls handiwork, as it was called, was part of their education. To sew, to embroider, to knit, to crochet. That was what things that are now, now it's like a sort of, some people take it up and it's very interesting, and you have knitting clubs and you have crochet clubs and you can learn this online, and it's something very new and something a rediscovery of these old things. But Rebecca, and she was very good at it, and it served her well, because she became a modista, as she called herself at one point. She became a seamstress, but a high class. She could create and she could design clothes, a couturière. Yes, she was, that's what she was. And she was always able to support herself and her family with these skills. She, as her granddaughter, the author says, she was also unconventional for her time, unusually forthright, and very comfortable in her body. She was very beautiful, and this comes out in the book, that she's very beautiful, and you can look at the pictures of her too. She's very beautiful. Even in what looked like to be a passport picture or the immigration picture, there's one with a stamp on it, she's lovely. And she knows it, and she makes use of it, and it serves her well. And if you remember, those of you who read it, when she meets Luna, the stepdaughter, for the first time, I'll read you that little bit, because I was like, there's Luna, this young girl who's 7 years old when she meets her, but whose body is crippled by cerebral palsy, and she's also unable to speak because of it, because nobody has really, her father tries to teach her to read, but other than that, she hasn't been to school. She is, as in Elisabeth Graeber's words, she is like an animal to me. She's unable to speak, she's not toilet trained, like, this is who I came to. So, and she's the antithesis of this beautiful new stepmother, and this is like the evil stepmother who comes, the very beautiful stepmother. That's the Rebecca. Not that Rebecca was mean or nasty, but it's the contrast here. So she says again, so I had these two cassettes of the recordings that I made with my grandmother, but it was decades before I returned to her story. what made me finally decide that I was ready to write this book? And meanwhile, she wrote four novels, 4 previous novels. The one before this, which is called, I forget the title of that one, was nominated for a National Book Award. So she's recognized, as well as I said, she teaches English, creative writing and nonfiction writing at Boston College. She said, especially after my grandmother died, the voices were always there with me. But what made me decide, okay, she said, I think I had gained confidence through the writing of my previous novel. It's called The End of the Point, not Jewish, with like no Jewish content to it, but it has a big cast of characters and it explores how individual lives intersect with major events in history. So which is what she's doing here, except through the characters of her own family, particularly her grandmother. And so she said, I was watching all these, refugee crises in the world, and I was aware of the passage of time. She was getting older. She's 60 years old now, Elisabeth Graeber. And she says, and then I knew my relatives were getting older, my uncles, and in the author's note, she says, my uncles David and Albert, who are Rebecca's 2 sons, who were born from Rebecca's first marriage in Constantinople. They came to America, and the author knew her uncles. She said, they helped me with the novel. I interviewed them, I had wonderful days interviewing them. Sadly, both of them died before the novel came out. And she said, my mother, who's well into her 80s now, has been my steady companion at every stage of this book. And so she says, I view this book both as a public imagining, public imagining, and as a private gift to my family. She's married and has 2 daughters, and her daughter is also, I don't know both of them, but one of them came along with her. She did extensive research, she traveled, she went to Barcelona, she went to Turkey when it was still, I guess, okay to go to Turkey when she was writing this book. And she says, so I thought of writing it as nonfiction, because that's what I wanted to talk about before I tell you, those of you who haven't read it, a bit about the story. She said, I did consider writing it as nonfiction, as it is so clearly based on my grandmother's story. But she said, but there were too many holes in the story, which is true, because what does she know? She's going from the 2 tapes that her grandmother left her in the interviews. She had her uncles at the time to ask, but the rest of it, she would have had to imagine anyway. She didn't have copious diaries to follow. So then, how could you write nonfiction, unless it's going to be a little article about my grandmother's family, my grandmother was born in Constantinople in 1902, and then she went here, and then she went there. But she wanted to do more, the author. She said, there were too many gaps, and I wasn't interested, because you have to think about this, which is, I always think about this when I read memoirs. So if you write a memoir about yourself, hopefully you remember what happened to you. Although, I don't know, that's a bit iffy too. Like, I don't think I could ever write a memoir because I don't remember what happened yesterday, so that wouldn't work. And then we realize that there are, people write their memoirs because once you say it's a memoir, it's supposed to be true, right? And then if you make up stuff and recreate things and say things that didn't quite happen, then you're accused of, I don't know what to be accused of. Well, not plagiarism, because that's copying, but of saying things that weren't true. Who was the one that a few years ago got into big trouble because he said,
A Million Pieces or something?
Yeah, right. So
it was about drug addicts, and it wasn't based on truth.
And so that's it. So then if you say you're writing, you pretended, and you say and you base, and it wasn't. So then then you lose your reputation as your credibility as a writer. So she said, I decided I couldn't do that and I was not interested in writing and pointing out, okay, but I don't know this part, and I don't know that part, and I'm sorry, but I have to tell you that I can't talk about this. Or I would have to mention my own position as a writer, sleuthing to reconstruct the past. So she said no. And she said, anyway, basically at heart, I'm a novelist. Even if I teach nonfiction writing, I'm a novelist at heart. And she said, what's the difference when you think of it? She puts it very nicely, because she said, I like to chart inner life. And that's really, to me, why you read good fiction, is that a writer, a good fiction writer, creates inner lives of people. Again, there has to be story, there has to be plot, there has to be description, the writing should be good. But to me, the interesting part of reading good fiction, believable characters, but somebody talking about the inner lives of people, imagined inner lives, which could be based on real people, but so she says, that's what I love to do. So that's why I wrote it as fiction. So I had to imagine my way inside the heads of my great-grandparents, for example, because in the book she writes about her grandmother Rebecca. She makes up a lot about, like, yes, she had those cassettes, but she talked to her grandmother, but she doesn't know all the things that happened, to her grandmother from when she starts her story, let's say in 1907, the details. Or she said, I had to make my way inside the heads and the hearts of my great-grandparents, of Alberto and Sultana, Rebecca's parents, who I never met in real life. And she said, but the characters were calling out to me. My great-grandfather Alberto, with his deep affection for Istanbul, his love of gardening, his bewilderment and bitterness at the turn that his life had taken. Remember, those of you who read those scenes, so when they have to go to Barcelona because they have no more money to live in Istanbul, then he takes this job, he goes to the Jewish community where in previous years he was the benefactor to people, and now he's going as the recipient of their aid, and he speaks to the man there and he says, so where can we go? And the man there says to him, Signor Alberto, your options, there aren't too many. To go to England and France, you need a great deal of money. Egypt as well. And too bad Vivian, because Vivian, who was sitting here before she started to come, her family is from Egypt. And she was saying that. So Egypt, you also had to have money. And so that's when Alberto, the author's great-grandfather, gets offered this position as a janitor, basically. But you have a chance to escape. You can go to Barcelona. How ironic, escape back to Barcelona where your families generations ago had to flee. But he takes it. But he's bitter. And you can imagine a man who walked around Istanbul in his finely tailored suits and who was giving out charity and who was, going and gambling, and people looked up to him and respected him. Now he has to take his family, and he doesn't tell them quite what they're going to Barcelona, and he finds that he goes with his suitcase. Do you remember this? He goes with his suitcase. He loves gardening. So he goes with his suitcase of plants and of seeds, and there's one scene in the book where Rebecca's mother finds this suitcase, and she's so angry at him because he's so miserable, and Sultana says to him, but you have to make the best of things. Do I always go around with a, sour face? No, I go out, I smile at the neighbors, I talk, I'm friendly, and you have to do the same thing. And then she takes this suitcase and she opens it up and she dumps all the plants and the seeds there into that garden of the place where they're living, that house, where the synagogue is in this little room. And they have a whole scene and a whole argument. But she said, you have to live. So she must have known, I guess her grandmother in those tapes must have said, my father loved gardening and he left Istanbul with a suitcase full of seedlings and plants, and then my mother dumped them out. But so she said, I had to write about that. I had to write about my great-grandmother, who was a caretaker, who was quiet in her sorrows, having to start anew at a not young age. And so she said, so soon I was deep inside truly fictional territory, while also still in conversation with the facts. So I thought that's a nice way of saying what this book is. That it's an interesting mix, because people could say, well, I don't know, is it fact, is it fiction? And if it's fiction, then why are there those family photographs and it's based on those characters? It's sort of odd. I don't know. I didn't look at it like that. I enjoyed this story. She also writes well. This is literary fiction, I think you could call it. There's a cadence to her writing, even though it's in English, it's not in Ladino, it's not that. But she has a lot of Ladino expressions as part of the story, which I don't know about you who read it, but they didn't bother me because she has translation. And and then there's French too, because she tells us that her grandmother Rebecca, and remember this was, Europe and other places at the time where to speak more than one language was no big deal. Here in Quebec it's like big deal that you have to speak 2 languages, and but in Europe, if you came from Europe, or if you came from countries in the Middle East, you spoke several languages, and that was no big deal about it. So I really like the aspect of here of all the Ladino that was part of the book, and the French expressions as well, because she tells us Rebecca went to a convent school there in Constantinople as a little girl, because the girls from the upper class families, that's the school that they went to. Kind of ironic, because this convent school where they were taught by nuns was founded by a Jewish German convert. That's who founded the school that all these girls went to, with the nuns teaching. And she says to us that, so once, when the Catholic girls had their Catholicism or catechism, whatever they learned, the Jewish girls were taken out, and they were taught by the interesting name, Monsieur Ashkenazi. He was their Jewish studies teacher. And when she describes it, she said, while Sister Maria, an old nun, slept in the corner of the room because it was not proper for us to be left alone with a male teacher. So that's the school she goes to. And she said, so the Jewish girls, there were enough of them that they got their own teacher. And there were so few Muslim girls, she noticed that they were given the time off and they could leave because there was nobody to, isn't that interesting? And that was Constantinople in the beginning, in the early years of the 20th century. So she says, and then she's asked, so why did you put the family photographs in? And she says, I know maybe that's an unconventional choice because it's fiction, but the family photographs are the real photographs of her own family. She said, okay, maybe it's unconventional, but Kantika has a relationship with a real family, happens to be mine, says the author, and it engages with an overlooked history, generally, of the 20th century immigrant Sephardic Jews. And she said, and that was very important to me. So I felt that including photographs was a way of showing this. Using real names is another way of showing this. And she says, photographs they're interesting, and they offer a glimpse of reality, even though some of the photographs are set up. And do you remember the first photograph, the opening one in the book? Sorry, it's a picture taken in a studio. Where is she? Sorry. There's this very old-fashioned portrait of a young woman and 3 children. It turns out that the young woman is the cousin, Rebecca's older cousin, Victoria, who was also their governess. And once a year, she says, my grandfather, I guess great-grandfather, liked to have the children's pictures taken, and he'd go to a photographer, and she says, the author says, look how different this was. It had to be set up in a studio, and those of you who are lucky enough to have old family pictures, back, like if you go back even to the beginning of the 19th century or early 20th century, the early years, it was still studio photography. And contrast that with now, yes, there's still, you can have your pictures taken professionally, but how does everybody do their photography? Comme ça, right? Every 2 minutes you can take a picture of everything. And there's this total reverse thing that instead of the planning and the dressing up and the setting up and the posing, which yes, it's artificial, but there was something about it as opposed to how, and it was not often that one did this. So people had pictures of either, I don't know if they went annually if you were wealthy, you had to be wealthy to do this anyway, back in 7 or 6 when this picture was taken, but it was an occasion. And now it's kind of, I think, almost the extreme opposite, where everybody is always taking pictures of everything. Not that is anybody ever going to look at these pictures afterwards? No. And you lose your phone, and unless it's saved up there and floating up in the clouds, you're never going to see them again. Whereas when you have these photographs, so I didn't have any problem with the idea of her family photographs anchoring the book. So she begins the story, and she says, as I dedicated to her mother and to her grandmother. She has this proverb, and she opens it up, and it's Constantinople, 1907. And just the name Constantinople, because when did it change to become Istanbul? I think after the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire crumbled, and that was the end of Constantinople. It got rechristened Istanbul. So she begins the same way that she's going to end the book. This is how she writes. This, the beautiful time, the time of wingspans, leaps, and open doors, of the heedless, headlong flow from here to there. This, the time before thought, the world arriving not as lists or hearkening back or future tense, but as breath-filled music, cantar, sing. Rebecca sings to the rhythm of the oars as the boat delivers her to school, and in school with the nuns. And so here she writes in French, Tournez vos yeux vers Jésus. And climbing rope at the Maccabee Gymnastics Club, hand over hand, and wrap your feet, girls. But she sings worldless tunes, nonsense sounds and ballads in Ladino, French, and bits of Turkish, Hebrew, Greek. She sings as she goes along the streets, as the lemon man sings lemons, the Bulgarian sings pudding, the vegetable man sings elephant, eggplant, squash, and artichokes. Fresh, cheap ladies, how I wait for you with my aubergine. She sings at school in chorus and for daily hymns, and at night her mother sings the children to sleep. Duerme, duerme, querido hijo. Sleep, sleep, darling boys, though two of them are girls. Anyway, she goes on and she talks about the singing. She describes her house at the top of the hill, and it's made of stone, not like the poor people's house at the bottom of the hill that were made of wood and were catching on fire because stone didn't burn. So she describes, and the first few pages are these beautiful, lyrical, very literary descriptions of what life was like. And she ends the first section by saying, again, this is in Ladino, quien no risica, no rosica, and translates as, whoever doesn't laugh, doesn't bloom. And somehow by the end of the story, you realize that her grandmother Rebecca, through all her, her trials and tribulations and travels and immigrations, at the end of the book, there's a beautiful picture of her grandmother. There's the last section is her grandmother standing, it's 1950 now. Remember, those of you who read the book, and there's a picture of her grandmother looking at herself in the mirror, and so it's 1950, and her grandmother was born in 1902, so she's only 48 years old. I mean, she's really not, and she's still very beautiful, still 48. She's very beautiful, and she stands there looking at herself in the mirror. She has flowers in her hair and a smile on her face. And so, she ends the book with the saying, this, the beautiful time. Anyway, the ending is good. I'm going to come back to that later. So she tells the story of this grandmother who was this little girl in Constantinople growing up. Family is wealthy, everything is wonderful. They have all the relatives around them. There is nothing to worry about. There's comfort. Her mother is able to be a charity lady, dispensing charity to the poorer people. She has siblings, and life is wonderful until eventually it's not going to be so wonderful. And they're going to have to move, and they end up going to Barcelona. Interestingly, just to give you a little bit of background, because I didn't know the history of how the Jews got to Turkey. So when the Jews were when they were escaping Spain due to the expulsion, which was in 1492, there were very few doors open to them. And although there are some legends that discuss Jews escaping to the Americas, very, very few chose to come to the Americas. The vast majority chose to go to a country that opened its doors and whose government mandate was to receive Jews cordially. So there, Spanish Jews joined other communities and built, arguably, I didn't realize this, the most prosperous Jewish community. I mean, this was back in the 16th and 17th centuries, because this was after 1492. And what country was this? The surprising answer was that this was Turkey. That Turkey was the country that was the best place for Jews to go. Turkey is one of the world's earliest continuously settled regions and was originally known as Anatolia. In case anybody wondered where that was Anatolia or Asia Minor. The capital of Turkey was known by different names at different points in history: Byzantium, Constantinople, and then Istanbul. And it was a thriving port city due to its prime geographic location, because you know it's there, like that's always been Turkey, it's between Europe and Asia, and it has this natural harbor on the shores of the Black Sea in the north and the Aegean to the west and the Mediterranean in the south. Like, talk about the center of the world. And there were early Jewish settlements that are mentioned way back by, if you know, the Jewish historian Josephus Flavius, back at the beginning of Common Era, like he lived, year 37 to 100 BCE, and Jews were there, and their presence increased. I'm not going to go into all the details. I was reading it because it was really very interesting, and so there was a very, very flourishing community. Statistics were kept way back when. Most of the Sultan's court physicians were Jews, as they were in Egypt, I believe, and other countries as well. Wherever the Jews came, they brought with them new techniques of navigation and weapons production, the printing press, and so they were welcomed. Turkey welcomed them. And then things started to get not so good, especially after World War I. World War I, which is what she writes about here. World War I ended the glory of the Ottoman Empire. And along with the glory of the Ottoman Empire went the good situation of Jews there. Because in place of the Ottoman Empire rose the young Turkish Republic. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, if you remember or know that name. He became president. The caliphate, the Muslim caliphate, was abolished, which is what they're now trying to recreate, but it was abolished and a secular constitution was adopted. However, in reality, Islam still remained inextricably intertwined with Turkish culture. So according to a census in 1927, there were 82,000 Jews living within the boundaries of the Turkish Republic. So that's quite a sizable community. But then things started to go bad. First of all, there was a tax levied at the different communities. That's kind of how it began in many times. And so the Jews were forced to emigrate. They were identified as foreigners, and a double standard was applied to their community. They were taxed at an extraordinarily high rate. So that's why in the book, and I'm just telling you this to get an understanding of what's going on here, why Rebecca's family had to leave. And apparently, there was a tax instituted in 1942 called which Rebecca's family had already left, but instituted in 1942, not 1492, but 1942. On average, this exceptional tax demanded 5% from Muslims and 150 to 200% from Greeks, Armenians, and Jews. And they had no way to pay this, and so they began the big final emigration of the Turkish Jewish community. The majority of them went to Israel, which was very close in 1948. And yet, interestingly, during the Second World War, Turkey became a safe passage for many of the Jews fleeing the Nazis. Safe passage. They didn't stay there, but they went through there. And now the present size of the Jewish community is estimated at around 14,000 Jews out of a population of 85 million. Most of them live in Istanbul, and 96% of the population are Sephardi. So that's the community now, although I'm wondering, especially in recent months, that it must be not a very, maybe not even such recent months, not very comfortable situation to be Jewish in Istanbul. And remember, Israelis love to travel to Turkey, always, like it was close, it was cheap, it was great. I think they have casinos in Istanbul, and now, not so much. Anyway, that's the background to this story. So she tells us through this fictionalized version of her grandmother's story, her grandmother's adventures. And the grandmother So they're living in Barcelona. Rebecca is 24 years old. She's already an old lady, an old single spinster at age 24, right? This is in the she was born in 1902, so 1926. And there's a tiny Jewish community, but there's some young guy, a bachelor, eligible, could be debatable, but anyways, he's 6 years older than Rebecca, and they get married. And she writes in the book, why did I marry him? She's speaking through the voice of Rebecca, her grandmother, because he was there. Anyways, she marries him. With him, she has 2 sons, but she had not been told that this man who she married, who on the surface looked to be fine, had fought in the First World War and was damaged. So he was mentally, as she says, how shall I say it, simple? But there was something very off with him. And he used to leave her, his young bride, with these 2 little, 16-month apart, 2 little boys, and go off. And finally at one point, and she was living in Barcelona at the time when she marries him, he would go back home to where he came from, to his family in Turkey. And at one point, she travels with her 2 little boys, remember that, you read that? Which is quite a journey, like she takes these 2 little boys on ships and trains, and they go to, and by the time she gets there, she finds out that her father is no longer, that their father is no longer alive. So she's this very young widow with these 2 little boys, and what does she do? She goes back to Barcelona with them, and she makes herself a business. She becomes this couturier, and she's like a woman of great strength of character. She sews these beautiful pieces as examples of her handiwork, and she takes them out, and in Barcelona, she goes from place to place trying to find herself a job because she's young and able-bodied, her mother can take care of the little boys, and she needs to contribute, to make a living. And she goes and she finds there, her father has said to her, don't say you're Jewish. Don't say you're Jewish. Say you can be Catholic, which wasn't so difficult for her because she'd gone to that convent school when she'd been growing up in Constantinople. So, and change your name. So she changes her name, she becomes Maria de Camador or something, she makes up a very nice name, and she is from Paris. Because she figures like that adds a certain cachet to herself, and she finds herself work, and soon, enterprising as she is, she's not working, after working for other seamstresses for a while, she opens up her own place, and she's able to employ others, and this is quite something. This is a young woman at that time, it wasn't so usual. And then at one point, she receives a letter. So of the family, Rebecca's older sister has been one who didn't go to Barcelona. She married a cousin, and she went to Cuba. And Cuba then, back in the 30s, was a haven, was a refuge for Jews, and especially Spanish-speaking Jews. I mean, they spoke Ladino, the Turkish Jews, but it was close enough to Spanish that they could, that it wasn't such a foreign language. She gets this letter from her sister in Havana, saying, your best childhood friend who had left and gone to New York years earlier, died in childbirth, but had left an older daughter, and Rebecca's sister Corinne says to her, there's this little girl, and the husband, who is a widower of your late close, dear best friend from childhood, I'm proposing you that, you come to Cuba and you meet him. He is alone with a child, you're alone with 2 little boys. If you like each other, get married. You can get into America that way because things are already now bad in Spain. And they're looking for ways to escape, to get out of Spain. America is not interested in having them. Her parents are getting older. She also has siblings in Barcelona. And the one sister who's gone away writes to the parents and says, how about this for Rebecca? So at least she and the 2 little boys can get out, can come to America. So Rebecca goes off to Havana, leaves her boys with her parents because she doesn't know. She goes to meet this man. This was before J-Date and the dating apps. And she meets him, and they hit it off. Quite like there's definitely, at least the way she describes it in the novel, I don't know, there's a great attraction. They have this quite passionate, like, well, even before honeymoon and then they get married, and she decides, okay, this is a good thing to do. And then she's gonna send for her boys, and they're gonna come over after. So she goes now, married, she goes to New York, where she meets her new husband, she's married for the second time now, very young and very pretty still, to this man who she likes. He seems like a decent enough fellow, and it makes sense for her to marry him, and the prospect of a new life, and the prospect of going to America, and being able to bring the rest of her family over. So now we in the section that I'll just read you a little bit of, we are in Astoria, which is in Queens, 1934, and there's a picture, which is a picture of Rebecca, very pretty, even in a passport picture, it's supposed to be. And she goes to this is the new world, and the husband she's met, because she married him in Cuba, and she goes to America, and she goes to his apartment, and she's now going to meet his mother, his sisters, and his daughter, who is the reason that they wanted the two of them to get married. How does she start this chapter? She writes, his daughter is an animal. And it's so interesting because there's a whole aspect of disabilities in this book as well. Pardon? Like Helen Keller, exactly, yes, if you remember that story where she couldn't, she
also said
yeah.
animal.
Yeah, because they're totally, they were totally untrained, unschooled, and with Helen Keller blind and deaf, how would, that was, yes, you're right. So she writes this, his daughter is an animal. It's a terrible thought that crosses Rebecca's mind upon meeting Luna, who has been primped and preened for her and Sam's arrival from Cuba. A pert bow in her hair, lace-trimmed ankle socks, a pink dress, the sash askew. But she is so twisted and wild-eyed, they might force clothing on a raging, captive creature. And in brackets, she has quite a few things in sentences in brackets in her writing, Rebecca, having just set foot on American soil, already feels similarly trapped. The guttural noises rising from the child's throat sound at first like random moans, but it soon becomes evident that they're aimed at Sam is her new husband, the father of this little girl, who unstraps his daughter from her chair and scoops her up and drapes her arms around his neck, her legs splayed out, her bent hand hammering his back. It is then, as Sam starts to rock and kiss Luna, that Rebecca assigns sense to the sounds coming from the girl's mouth. Pa, 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 pa. And Sam pivots so that Luna faces Rebecca. This is your new mother, Lunita. And the sounds morph into a bleating meaning clear, aimed straight at her, pushing past a revulsion that makes her despise herself and the child. At the same time, Rebecca steps forward to deposit a kiss on Luna's cheek, which is slick with drool and tears. A terrific scream issues forth as if the girl has been shot. Rebecca pulls away. Oh, I'm so sorry, Sam. Did I hurt her? No. He pivots his daughter's head to face his own. Everything is all right, Lunita. Everything is all right. She's just excited to meet you and that her papa is home. That's the introduction. And then she finds out that Sam's mother, her mother-in-law, is standing there, and the relationship, she steps into this apartment in Queens where her mother-in-law lives, Sam's mother, who takes care of Lunita, like she takes care of her, and a sister who lives nearby as well. And the mother-in-law is not happy at this idea of the new daughter-in-law, especially this beautiful, like this very fashionably dressed young woman comes in, the new wife, and here's his mother, who she describes as being very, very thin and very, very stern, with a gray bun tightly on the back of her head that is not at all friendly to her. So here is Rebecca's new life in the new world. And she writes back to her sister and she said, you didn't tell me anything about this girl. You said that she had a difficult birth and she had some medical challenges, which is what the sister had told. But you didn't tell me that she was an animal, a totally what am I gonna do? But because Rebecca is a character, she takes it upon herself and she succeeds at this. this is quite the story, that she decides that she's going to try and educate this girl. This is her stepdaughter, and meanwhile her two little boys can't come, they can't get them. So she's missing her own two little boys, who eventually they do make it out, but by themselves. Rebecca's not able to bring her parents, who sadly die in Barcelona. She never sees them again. And basically they die. The situation becomes so difficult for Jews there, but in the meanwhile, at least her little boys eventually get to go. But she starts to help Luna. And those of you who read it, there's another real life character put in there, a man by the name of Dr. Earl Carlson. Do you remember that? He was a man who started a school for children with, now we would say, special needs. But back then it was called crippled children, because that was the terminology. You know, we would never think of saying things like that now, but okay, that's what it was. And this Dr. Earl Carlson, and she says in the note, she says that I found out that my Aunt Luna did eventually go to this school, thanks to my grandmother Rebecca, who was pushing for her to be educated against the wishes of the grandmother, who wanted just to keep her at home. Because when Rebecca goes there, Luna is wearing diapers. And Rebecca says, well, have you ever tried this child to take her to the bathroom? And the grandmother says, no, she can't do that. There's no way she can do it. How could she do that? And then the description that the bathroom isn't even in their apartment. It's down, up some stairs and down the hall. And this girl with the child is not really walking. She could slither around on her bottom or on her front. But so she wears diapers, and there are no Pampers in those days, you will have to recall, in 1930, whatever. So it was anyway, Rebecca sets out, and she, it seems, according to this story, is responsible for Luna becoming, and Luna is very bright. There's nothing wrong with her mind. She's very, very bright. It's just physical challenges. And it was this Dr. Earl Carlson, who himself, what a man, he was born in 1897, had a difficult birth, because I looked him up, because she said he's a real person, and I put his name in because he really was the doctor who was responsible, who created the school that my Aunt Luna went to, and was responsible for her becoming a functioning, literate, fluently speaking. And as she says, my Aunt Luna went on, she married twice, she had a child, which is at the end of the book. You remember that? That's where Rebecca says, I want everybody to know there's a concert, and Rebecca is singing her Ladino songs to this group of Jewish ladies at their synagogue or temple out in Queens. And Luna and husband come to attend the concert where Rebecca is singing, and at the end of it she says, I want everybody in the audience to know, this is my daughter Luna, and she and her husband, inshallah, meaning God willing, in Ladino, are expecting a child. And you think, wow, from this little girl who she meets, who she says, is an animal, to becoming she's able to be married and to have a child of her own. Anyway, so this Dr. Earl Carlson was quite a man, because he was born with cerebral palsy as well, although it was called back in the day spastic and athetoid paralysis. That was the term. It wasn't cerebral palsy. And the neighbors looked pityingly upon him, and his mother just kept telling everybody he was just born that way. But he was very bright. Education was important. He went to medical school, and he was responsible for this school for crippled children that was in the city that Rebecca fought that her little stepdaughter should be able to go to. And then Luna she worked for the department of, I forget what, she worked in the hospitals and in the municipal hospitals in New York City. So that was something that Rebecca was very successful at doing. And the story goes, and it's really the story of a fascinating, well, you don't have to live through the hardships of it, but as a read, a fascinating story of this very strong woman and how she began her life in 1902 in Constantinople and ended up living in Queens. I think this section was called Cambria Heights, where they bought their place. It ends in 1950. Eventually, we know from the author's note that her grandmother Rebecca and her grandpa Sam, they retired to Florida, because that's where the author went to interview her during the last years. And she definitely made a life for herself. But what a story of immigration, of hardship, of overcoming hardship, and because this Rebecca was a very strong character and able to do it, she has this fascinating life story. So it really has all the material that one needs for a fascinating piece of historical fiction. But this book, I think, is interesting in the particular sense that it's fiction because the lives, the inner imagined lives of the characters are just that. They're fiction and they're imagined. But the basis of the story is the author's family's own story, which is what, that was her point, that she wanted to tell the story of her family. There's, just to finish with, I found this little article published a year ago in, I forget which periodical, and there's a nice picture. It's not in one of the books. It's a picture of, it's hard to see here, but Rebecca, and she's there with her two sons, Berto and the two boys who were David, who were born, or David, as it becomes David in America, and the author's mother, little Suzanne, and Luna, and they're sitting at Jones Beach, and she writes, Elisabeth Graver, she says, I was so happy to be able to talk about Kantika on this particular podcast, and what made me happy about this podcast was that it gave me the chance toward the end of the podcast to focus on the character of Luna, who was inspired by my wonderful aunt, Luna Leibowitz. Luna was born in 1927 in New York City to an immigrant Sephardic family. Her birth mother tragically died in childbirth a few years later, along with her newborn baby, and that's the childhood best friend of Rebecca. In 1934, my grandmother Rebecca became Luna's stepmother after she had an arranged marriage to my grandfather, Luna's father, Sam, bringing into the marriage her own two children who had lost their father. They were a blended immigrant family with a history of deep loss. Over the duration, they formed deep bonds as well. In this photo, taken above at Jones Beach, on the far right is my Aunt Luna, next to her stepbrother Albert. Rebecca sits in the middle holding baby Suzanne, my mom, says the author, with her son David to her left. I won't give away too much to readers who haven't read the novel, but suffice it to say that Luna plays a vital part in the book, both in her own right as a smart, angry, passionate, full of life, disabled girl struggling to find her way in a world of prejudice, and in terms of her relationship to Rebecca, my grandmother, who is both key to Luna becoming mobile and a source of a lot of tension, because that's in the second part of the book, because Luna, she calls her new mother. That's what she calls her, new mother, and she hates her because new mother is trying to do all kinds of terrible things to her, to use a toilet, or first to use a potty and then a toilet, and she wants her to do this, and she wants her to try and go to the bathroom by herself and go places, and then she wants to send her to school, and so there was a lot of tension, but it was Rebecca who enabled Luna to become a functioning adult. So the author continues, in real life, my Aunt Luna led an active and full life. She married twice, had a child, and worked in municipal jobs for the city of New York. She took up writing in her retirement in Florida, focusing on the retirement and disability communities, which I didn't have a chance to Google it, but it would be fun to look her up. There, down in Florida, as well as occasionally on her own childhood. She regularly published articles in the Sun Sentinel, newspaper down in Florida, realizing her lifelong dream to become a published writer. Sadly, Luna died before I started writing Kantika. She always followed my path as a writer with great interest. I wish she had had a chance to tell her own full story, and I hope she would have given her blessing to my portrait of her in my book. May her memory be a blessing. Anyway, it's, for those of you who haven't read it, I think you'll enjoy it. An interesting mix of fiction and non-fiction, but told in a style, the writing is, to me, beautiful, lyrical, suits the title of Kantika, which means song, because there's something sing-song and lyrical, and singing is so much part of the book. Those of you who read it, comments, questions?
I just have a comment about the cerebral palsy.
Yeah.
Because this was in the 40s, I knew somebody
Yeah.
that had cerebral palsy. I don't know what the outcome of it was.
Right.
But they also were, every day they were picked up and they were taken
To a special school,
They had,
yeah,
they
yeah,
had to be carried actually.
yeah, yeah.
Because they lived up
Flights of stairs, and that's very much part of the book too, the carrying down of the stairs. Yeah, 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 yeah,
But I don't know what the
Yeah.
end of it was, but I did know somebody in the
Yeah.
forties,
And it was-
early forties.
and there was these like difficult births and the lungs weren't developed and then, you know, constantly having to suction the lungs. But what was pointed out, which I thought was interesting, because I remember when I was a kid, do you remember the Easter Seals campaign? And that's what it was, and this Dr. Carlson, he started that as a fundraiser, the Easter Seals for crippled children. Well, I guess they expanded it, but it was the Easter Seals for crippled children, and that's what, you know, that's what he fought back then, for these children to be able to go to school. And so now I just have to look up Luna and see if we could find any, I don't know if it's, you know, we'll be able to find them, but what she wrote. Yes?
Did Rebecca ever get along with her mother-in-law later on?
So I don't know, I mean, I didn't find that in any of the interviews, and in the book, so what happens in the book, remember at least, well, yeah, so what happens, and I don't know if this is based on a true incident, I'm thinking probably, there's a scene where Luna is at home with the grandmother's still living at home, and Luna, in the book, she begs and bugs her grandmother. She wants a hot bun from the bakery, and so finally her grandmother, okay, she agrees, she gets dressed, she puts on laces up her walking shoes to go out, and the grandmother, who's not such a strong person as she's described, has to carry her down the stairs. They fall, her grandmother breaks her hip, it's repaired, even back in the time it was repaired, but she never comes back to live with Rebecca and Luna. She goes to live with the daughter who lived on a ground floor apartment, because the grandmother, could never walk upstairs again because of that. So I don't know. So the mentions are that yes, the grandmother went to live with the aunt, and she's still part of their lives, but she couldn't take care of Luna anymore. So for Rebecca, this was freedom, and now grandmother was off the scene, and she couldn't interfere anymore, and Rebecca takes Luna into hand, and she proceeds to train her and get her ready and creates this functional person. Yeah.
So is this a reality that a person with cerebral palsy could lead a normal life like that?
Well, I think so, because that part was real.
In general, that's real for her.
Yeah.
Is it real for other?
I mean, I don't know case by case. I guess it depends on the severity of the cerebral palsy and the lung functioning, because that's one of the issues. And the mental state too. She was very bright. She had no mental damage when she was born.
And not even when two people have the same disease, it doesn't necessarily
Manifest itself the same way. Yeah.
I mean, their comorbidity is like a lot of people, if they have one diagnosis,
And then they have-
something else.
Right.
Yeah.
So it depends on what.
Yeah.
I worked with a woman who was a librarian actually, at the school I was working at, and she had cerebral palsy and nobody would have known. I mean, she had a little bit of problem walking,
Yeah.
but I was a science teacher, so she told me, she recounted the story. But yeah, nobody would.
So I guess there is different severity of
Oh,
the,
yeah, she
yeah.
was,
Yeah.
and she was very intelligent. The only thing was that, her walking, she was at that time maybe in her 40s, I was in my 20s. Her walking wasn't quite.
Yeah, that would have been the only thing that
That
would
was
have
the
been
thing
the
that
only
was
thing.
apparent to me as a
Yeah,
20-year-old.
yeah.
If Rebecca wouldn't have taken a stand, the child would never have developed.
No.
It seemed like that in that case, I don't know, with the grandmother, would she have, because grandmother was not interested in sending her to school or to toilet training her.
But they didn't understand that was what had to be done.
And it seemed cruel, like you're forcing this child to do these things that she.
I also have an aunt who is now 90, and when she was 6 years old, she was born deaf. When she was 6 years old, her parents sent her off to the school in Boston. They were wealthy, for the hearing impaired, so she learned how to lip read. she went off to a boarding school, she hated it. And when she came home in the summertime, her parents would not send her to the camp for the, what is it called, people that can't speak.
Yeah.
She went to regular camps. Yeah, so,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, so,
So it's a very interesting, I think, and a welcome addition to immigrant stories and Jewish immigrant stories, subset, Sephardi, even subset of the Turkish Jewish community as opposed to the Egyptian, or, I mean, I guess there's not too many others, North African, Egyptian maybe, but, and who are writing stories, I know especially the Egyptian, a couple of Egyptian writers.
Ladino is.
Ladino, the official definition is Judeo-Spanish. It's like Yiddish is the Ashkenazi, based on, I think, Old German.
German and Hebrew.
German and Hebrew. So this is it's Spanish and Hebrew. That's what it is. That's Ladino. And apparently there are all these different versions of it. Each community has its own version. Like there's
In Italy,
in Italy, Italian Jews are very different though. They have their whole own, I don't even know if they're considered Sephardi. They have an Italian, like an Italian way that's specific. But let's say Jews of Morocco, they speak a certain, theirs is Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, whereas the Turkish Jews was Judeo-Spanish. Yeah, they have all different versions of Ladino. I guess it's like in Yiddish, there are the Polish and the Russian and then
Yeah, but those are just accents.
just accents.
no,
So,
they're
Mostly
different.
the same language.
but then maybe, the Ladino, because Arabic is not Spanish, so I would think that the different Ladinos or different Judeo-Arabic are different languages. Yeah. But it served Rebecca and her family well when they had to go to Barcelona, that at least their language at home was Ladino, so it was like a dialect of Spanish, so they could manage a bit better.
They could learn.
And then when she came to America, that's interesting, she goes to New York. I mean, I don't know if there were so many Spanish-speaking immigrants in New York in the 1930s, probably not so many. Like now, Spanish is a second language in New York, right? But back in the day, maybe not so much, but how her boys come and how they feel uncomfortable and they have accents.
Did they know English in
No.
Constantinople? Because
No.
I think she and her
French,
her
it seemed
close
like
friend,
French.
At one point, it's near the beginning, they say English is their secret language.
So the parents, a very little bit, but it was more French. It was more French, was their other language.
Two girls did not learn English in the convent.
No, because she talks about when she goes to America, about her difficulty with English. She spoke Ladino to Sam, her husband, and to Luna, and to even when her boys come over, and not so much the new kids, and then they have children together, Sam and Rebecca, and so she talks Ladino to them, but she says their Ladino's not so good. They can understand, like immigrant kids, their parents talk one language and they speak English back, or whatever the language of the country they live in, they speak back. So, anyway, I thought a very interesting book, yeah, and so much of background and interesting stuff comes out when you're talking about it. Thank you very much.